Why hello, I'm Ryan, and this is my presentation on the history of Rinderpest and its role as a technology. As I'm sure you know, Rinderpest was a disease that plagued the cattle of Asia, Europe, and Africa. Symptoms of Rinderpest were commonly seen as fluid around the eyes, sores in the mouth, diarrhea, and death. Historical accounts of the origin of Rinderpest suggest that it first began on the Eurasian footsteppes. The first time Rinderpest was actually recorded by anyone was in Europe in the year 376 after death. However, there is evidence to suggest that Rinderpest was around much earlier than this, in 3000 BC. How long has Rinderpest existed? This is a difficult question to answer. It is believed by many scientists that Rinderpest has existed as long as humans have domesticated animals and livestock. However, this theory is not entirely proven. It is quite tough to say. This theory is backed up by the loads of evidence that we know about that say that Rinderpest plagued Europe for centuries and centuries. Rinderpest in Egypt, 3000 BC. Now, in Egypt, 3,000 years ago, Rinderpest plagued the cattle. However, the Egyptians took this as a sign from the god. In the Bible, specifically the book of Exodus, there's a plague that is discussed. Now, however, modern science today would classify this simply as a case of Rinderpest. But the Egyptians believed they were being punished by the gods. The Hebrews also had this written in their book, the Torah. Now, this is a fantastic example of how Rinderpest has shaped early human civilization. Where has Rinderpest been? Now, as we can see on the map, the earliest places to eradicate Rinderpest were first in Scandinavia and in the Middle East. And then, as we could imagine, Europe was then next to eradicate the disease, and then parts of the southern continent of Africa. The next places the disease were eradicated were in Eurasia, Australia, and Brazil. However, in Brazil and Australia, they were very minor cases. It did not become a plague. The disease did not have a great effect on the cattle populations on those continents. But the last time they did have a case was in the 50s. In the 50s, the disease was also eradicated in China. And then later on in the 60s, African countries were also able to eradicate the disease for the last time. And more countries were able to accomplish this in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even the 2000s. The disease managed to stick around that long, even though immunization was already developed for this disease. Now, the disease was eradicated in Europe earlier than all of these other countries, a lot of it due to systematic killing of any cattle that would show signs of Rinderpest, the cattle plague. This was very effective in controlling the disease. However, it was very consequential in loss of cattle. Rinderpest entering Europe had much to do with the Mongols and their leader Genghis Khan. Now, what the Mongols would do before invading Europe was send cows infected with the Rinderpest virus into Europe to infect other groups of cattle. And the disease would spread so on and so on. And then what would happen as a result of this is the empires inhabiting Europe would collapse. There would be much starvation and famine, and they would have no milk and food from the cows. When Genghis Khan first invaded Europe was 1222. Now, of course, with this invasion came a wave of Rinderpest into Europe. This happened with the first Mongol invasion in 1222, but it also happened again in 1233 and 1238 when they invaded 2 more times. This is an example of how Rinderpest was used as a biochemical weapon. But most importantly, it is the first example of disease being used in biological warfare. And Genghis Khan being so innovative to use it to defeat his enemies in Europe. Rinderpest being used in this way is a fantastic example of actor network theory being used with this technology. Rinderpest causes famine and starvation in Europe and the collapse of many of the great empires, allowing the Mongols to invade. This is a fantastic example of how the technology affects the society. Actor network theory in Rinderpest. Now, there are so many examples that can be made throughout history of Rinderpest fitting in to actor network theory. Now, of course, like I just mentioned, we see it with the Mongol invasion of Europe, the collapse of empires and societies, allowing the Mongols to come into Europe, but we also see it, like I had mentioned before, in Egypt, how the Hebrews and the Egyptians were interpreting the plague as a sign of God punishing them. In both of the instances I have just mentioned, Rinderpest can be found in the middle of everything. Now, there are many other examples in history of Rinderpest affecting societies, cultures, and so many other things. And the 2 examples I just discussed, they connect religion, people, warfare, and the disease. But another example of a technology developed as a result of Rinderpest, our first technology, is the vaccines developed to prevent Rinderpest infecting more cattle and plaguing Africa, Europe, and Asia. The end of Rinderpest. Now, like many diseases, with the development of vaccines, came to an end. This was also the case for Rinderpest and its effect on cattle and other livestock. Now, the first attempts to create a vaccine against Rinderpest came in England and the Netherlands in 1744. Walter Plowright was the man who developed this first vaccine. It was so impressive because he developed an inactivated vaccine that had no side effects on the cattle, and it also provided lifelong immunity for them, protecting them their entire lives. Now, this was the first successful virus that had been developed to prevent Rinderpest. Now, the vaccine was created and implemented in 1960. And this is why, from then on, we see many more countries included in the map I previously showed, countries that had beaten the disease of rinderpest. The vaccine developed was by far the best method ever composed to prevent the spread of rinderpest. Other methods, such as simply killing the cattle or isolating them, were not nearly as effective as the implementation of this vaccine. Now, even though the vaccine for this disease was developed in 1960, it took many countries long periods of time to fully implement, and the disease was not declared eradicated until the year 2011 by the World Health Organization. And since then, there have been no more cases of rinderpest anywhere, and the disease appears to be wiped off the face of the earth, coming to an end. Now, thank you. That is the end of my presentation, and thanks for listening. Does anybody have any questions?
I do.
What's
I
your
just wanted to
question?
say that was a great presentation. My question is, when was the last reported case of rinderpest?
The last reported case of rinderpest was in 2003 in Kenya.
Wow, that's great. All the cows must be so safe now.
Moo.